Millionaire laughed at her sentence, and what the judge did shocked the courtroom. Jessica Miller burst into a loud, piercing laugh that echoed through the entire Los Angeles County Courthouse when the judge finished reading the sentence, ordering her to pay alimony to her own elderly mother. The deep, humorless sound of her laughter left the entire courtroom in shock at such blatant disrespect. But what no one there knew was that this laugh concealed decades of pent-up bitterness in the heart of an abandoned daughter. Then, something happened that left everyone speechless. Judge Robert Thompson, known throughout the Capitol for his strictness and seriousness, did something completely unexpected. He slowly rose from his chair, picked up the sentence he had just read, and, in front of a packed courtroom of over 200 people, tore the document in half, declaring in a firm voice that he would review the case personally. Jessica stopped laughing instantly. Her brown eyes widened as she watched the pieces of paper fall to the courtroom floor. She had never seen anything like it in her 35 years of life. Across the room, her mother Margaret, a 72-year-old woman seated in the front row, wept uncontrollably while her daughter stared at the judge, unable to process what had just happened. "I order a 2-hour recess," announced Judge Robert, banging his gavel forcefully. "I want both parties in my private chambers at 3 o'clock this afternoon. This case requires deeper consideration." A murmur spread through the room. Lawyers whispered among themselves, journalists rushed to call their newsrooms, and spectators quietly commented on the unprecedented event. Jessica left the courtroom still in shock, closely followed by her attorney, Attorney Michael Wilson, a 50-year-old man who had won every major case for the businesswoman over the last 10 years. "Jessica, this has never happened before," said Michael, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Judge Thompson is known for being unyielding. Something about your reaction deeply unsettled him." "To hell with him," Jessica replied, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "My mother doesn't deserve a single penny from me. If she wants money, she can go get a job." But beneath her tough demeanor, Jessica felt a tightness in her chest she couldn't explain. The image of her mother crying had stirred something deep inside her, something she had tried to bury long ago. As she walked through the courthouse halls, memories came rushing back like violent waves. Years earlier, when Jessica was just 8 years old, Margaret had vanished from home without warning. The little girl woke up one Sunday morning to find only a note on the kitchen table. "I have to leave. Take care of yourself." Margaret had run off with Darren, a car salesman who had promised her luxury and a better life. Jessica was left in the care of Mrs. Dorothy, a kind neighbor who raised her as her own. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. It was Mrs. Dorothy who taught Jessica to read, who took her to school, who nursed her when she was sick. When Jessica turned 18, Mrs. Dorothy passed away from heart problems, leaving the young woman completely alone in the world. Margaret never even showed up for the funeral of the woman who had raised her daughter. Jessica built her empire from scratch, starting with a small clothing store downtown. She worked 16 hours a day, saved every penny, and reinvested everything into the business. By 25, she owned 3 stores. By 30, she had one of the largest women's retail chains in the state of California. But the void left by her mother was never filled, no matter how many professional victories she achieved. Margaret's return happened 6 months ago, when Jessica was featured on the cover of Fortune as one of the country's most successful businesswomen. Her mother showed up at the door of the mansion in Beverly Hills, pretending to be remorseful, claiming she was going through financial difficulties and needed help. Jessica kicked her out of the house right then and there. 27 years, Mom. 27 years without a word, and now you show up here asking for money, Jessica had shouted that day, tears streaming down her face. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Margaret had insisted, coming back other times, always with the same talk about regret and need. When Jessica refused to help her for good, her mother filed a lawsuit, claiming neglect of a dependent and demanding alimony. Now, sitting in Judge Robert Thompson's private office, Jessica observed every detail of the room. The shelves filled with legal books, the diplomas on the wall, the photo of a smiling young woman on the judge's desk. The magistrate entered the room carrying a thick folder and sat across from the two women. "I'll be direct," Judge Robert began, taking off his glasses and cleaning the lenses. "In 30 years on the bench, I've never seen a reaction like yours, Miss Miller. That laughter, there was something deeply painful behind it." Jessica crossed her arms and lifted her chin defiantly. "Your Honor, I have no obligation to support someone who abandoned me. It's as simple as that." "Nothing is simple when it comes to family," the judge countered, staring straight at her. "Your mother claims she wasn't in a position to raise you back then. She says she suffered domestic violence from your father." "Lies!" Jessica exploded, slamming her hand on the table. "My father was never violent. She left because she was selfish and wanted an easy life." Margaret, who had stayed quiet until then, started crying again. "Jessica, you were too young. You didn't see what I went through. Your father, he drank and—" "Enough with the lies." Jessica stood abruptly. "My father worked 2 jobs to support me after you ran away. He worked himself to death until he had a heart attack at 45, and you didn't even show up to the funeral." A heavy silence filled the room. Judge Robert watched the interaction between mother and daughter with a thoughtful expression. There was something in the story that didn't quite add up. He could feel it. "I propose family mediation," he finally said. "Supervised sessions where you can talk more calmly. There are many truths that need to come out before any legal decision." Attorney Barbara Johnson, Margaret's lawyer, protested vehemently. "Your Honor, the law is clear. The daughter has the financial means and the mother is in need. There's no need for family therapy. The law also gives me the authority to seek the best solution for each case," the judge countered. "And this case requires a different approach." Jessica left the room without a word. In the courthouse parking lot, she lit another cigarette and leaned against her black Lexus, thinking over the whole situation. Michael approached carefully. "What do you think of the judge's proposal?" "I think it's a waste of time," Jessica replied, but her voice lacked the same conviction as before. 3 days later, Jessica found herself in a small room at the courthouse, specially prepared for family mediations. The psychologist in charge, Dr. Emily Richards, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and a gentle gaze, explained how the sessions would work. "The goal here isn't to decide who's right or wrong," Dr. Emily said. "It's to understand what happened and how it affected both of you over the years." Jessica was visibly uncomfortable. She fidgeted with her hands constantly and avoided looking directly at her mother, who sat across the table. "Margaret, I'd like you to start by telling your side of the story," the psychologist requested. The 72-year-old woman took a deep breath before speaking. Her trembling voice revealed how hard it was to revisit those memories. "When Jessica was born, I was only 17. Stephen, her father, was 25. At first he was affectionate, treated me well, but after we got married, everything changed completely." Jessica scoffed, shaking her head in denial. "He started drinking heavily," Margaret continued. "He'd come home late at night, always reeking of alcohol. When I complained, he'd hit me. Once he broke my nose. Another time he pushed me down the stairs, and I was hospitalized for 2 days." "That's a lie," Jessica interrupted. "My father was never violent. You're making this up to justify yourself." "Jessica, you were 8 years old," Margaret said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "The fights always happened after you were asleep. I made sure you never saw anything." The psychologist intervened gently. "Jessica, how do you remember that time in your childhood?" "I remember my father leaving early for work and coming home exhausted. I remember my mother always complaining about everything, never satisfied. And I remember the day she just disappeared without explanation." "And how did you feel when she left?" Jessica fell silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "I woke up, and she wasn't there. I thought she'd gone to the store. I waited all day. When my father came home from work and saw the note, he cried. I'd never seen him cry before." "I couldn't take it anymore," Margaret whispered. "Darren promised he'd take care of me, that he'd take me far away." "I was desperate. So you chose a stranger over your own daughter," Jessica said, bitterness clear in every word. The first few sessions remained tense and unproductive. Jessica refused to accept her mother's version of the domestic violence, and Margaret couldn't convincingly explain why she'd abandoned her daughter. Judge Robert reviewed the reports with concern. It was during the fourth session that something began to shift. Dr. Emily had asked Jessica to bring childhood photos. As they flipped through the old album, Margaret stopped at a specific picture. "This was taken 2 weeks before I left," she said, pointing to an image where she appeared with a cast on her arm. "Do you remember how I broke my arm?" Jessica studied the photo carefully. She truly couldn't recall the accident that had caused the fracture. "Your father said you'd fallen down the stairs," Margaret murmured. "But the truth is he pushed me during an argument." "Why don't I remember this?" "Because you were at school when it happened, and by the time you got home I already had the cast on and the official story ready." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. For the first time, Jessica began questioning her own memories. Could an 8-year-old really grasp the full complexity of her parents' lives? She started recalling small details she'd blocked out. The sound of muffled arguments from her parents' bedroom, her mother's face always swollen the morning after a bad night, the way Margaret would shrink when Stephen came home. "I tried to protect you from all of it," Margaret said during the next session. "But there came a point when I couldn't protect myself or you anymore. Darren said he'd take me to a small town where Stephen would never find us. Then why didn't you take me with you? He said it would be very complicated, that Stephen would never allow it. He said that after we officially married, we'd come back to get her. I believed him like a fool." "What happened next?" Margaret took a deep breath before continuing. "Darren took me to a small town in rural Montana. For the first few months, he kept his promises. He found a job for himself, we rented a simple little house, and I started working at a seamstress shop. I wrote letters to you every week." "I never got any letters," said Jessica, suspicious. "I know. Later, I found out Darren intercepted all of them. He said your father had threatened to sue for abandonment if I tried to contact you, that it was better to wait for things to calm down." Jessica felt a tightness in her chest. Were there letters? Had her mother really tried to reach out? "After a year, Darren started drinking too," Margaret went on. "And then I realized I'd traded one hell for another. He hit me, controlled every penny I earned, wouldn't let me talk to anyone. When I tried to run away and go back to Los Angeles, he threatened to turn me in, saying your father would report me for abandonment." "And you stayed there all those years?" "I did. 26 years in a town where I knew no one, working at a seamstress shop that barely paid enough to survive. Darren controlled me completely. I only got out when he passed away last year." Jessica absorbed every word with a mix of disbelief and growing curiosity. Part of her still resisted believing her mother, but another part was starting to see gaps in her own version of the story. That was when Dr. Emily made a suggestion that would change everything. "Jessica, would you mind if we brought Mrs. Dorothy to one of the sessions? Maybe she could clarify some parts of the story." "Mrs. Dorothy died 17 years ago," Jessica replied, confused. "No, dear, Mrs. Dorothy is alive. She's 86 and lives in a nursing home here in Los Angeles. I reached out to her after you mentioned her name in our first sessions." Jessica was stunned. All these years, she'd thought the woman who raised her was gone forever. Knowing she was alive and that they could reunite stirred her emotions deeply. The next session took place in a larger room at the Los Angeles County Courthouse. When Mrs. Dorothy entered leaning on a cane and accompanied by a nurse, Jessica couldn't hold back her tears. The woman was frailer now, with completely white hair and slow movements, but her warm smile was exactly the same as in Jessica's childhood. "My girl," Mrs. Dorothy said, opening her arms. "Look how you've grown. So beautiful." Jessica stood up and ran to embrace the woman who had been her real mother during the most important years of her upbringing. They held each other for several minutes, both crying, making up for decades of lost time. "I tried to find you after you grew up," Mrs. Dorothy said once they sat down, "but you changed your name when you started your company, and I couldn't track you down." "Why didn't you tell me you were alive?" Jessica asked, holding the older woman's wrinkled hands. "After you left home at 18, I thought it was better not to interfere with your life." You were building your future and I was just an old woman. You were never just an old woman to me. You were my real mother." Margaret watched the reunion with a mix of gratitude and sadness. Seeing that her daughter had been loved and cared for in her absence brought her peace, but it also reminded her of all she'd lost. "Mrs. Dorothy," the psychologist said, "do you remember what Jessica's family situation was like before her mother left?" The elderly woman sighed before answering. "Yes, I remember. Margaret always had bruises. Many times she would come to my house with a swollen face, saying she had fallen or bumped into something. Stephen drank heavily and had a difficult temper. Jessica felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. When Margaret left, Stephen came to talk to me," continued Mrs. Dorothy. "He was desperate, crying like a child. He said he didn't know how to raise a girl alone and asked me to help. I agreed because Jessica was already like a granddaughter to me." "My father never told me he asked Mrs. Dorothy for help," murmured Jessica. "Stephen was a proud man. After he stopped drinking, he became a different person. He worked hard to support both of you and was completely devoted to Jessica. But in the first few years after Margaret left, he was destroyed." "He stopped drinking?" "Completely. I think losing his wife, despite all their problems, made him rethink his life. He became an exemplary father, but he carried enormous guilt for what he had done in the past." Mrs. Dorothy's revelations completely changed Jessica's perspective on the whole situation. For the first time since the process began, she started to consider that maybe her mother's version was true. "Did Margaret try to get in touch?" asked Jessica, looking directly at her mother for the first time in weeks. "Many times in the first few years," replied Mrs. Dorothy. "She sent letters, birthday gifts, Christmas cards. I kept everything in a box waiting for the right day to give them to you." "Where are those things?" "In my room at the nursing home. If you want, I can ask them to bring it on their next visit." Jessica barely slept that night. The possibility that her mother had truly tried to stay in touch, that she hadn't been completely abandoned, shook all the certainties she had built over her life. 3 days later, Mrs. Dorothy arrived at the session carrying a shoebox tied with a red string. Inside were dozens of letters, birthday cards, small gifts, and a few photos. "Why did you never give me any of this?" asked Jessica, handling the letters with trembling hands. "Stephen asked me not to. He thought it would confuse you, that it was better for you to believe your mother no longer wanted anything to do with you. I didn't agree, but he was the father and had the right to decide." Jessica opened one of the letters, dated 2 months after her mother's departure. Margaret's handwriting was neat and full of affection. "My dearest Jessica, Mommy thinks of you every day. I know you must be angry with me for leaving, but I hope one day you'll understand I had no choice. Darren promised we'd be together again soon. Are you studying well? Eating properly? Mommy loves you more than anything in this world and counts the days until I see you again." Jessica cried as she read. There were several similar letters, all expressing love and longing. Among the gifts, she found a small doll, some sweets, and a necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. "I sent what I could," said Margaret, also crying. "I didn't have much money, but I tried to show I was thinking of you." "Why did they stop coming?" "After 2 years, Stephen wrote me a very harsh letter. He said you had asked why I never came back and that you were getting confused by the situation. He asked me to stop sending anything until you were older and could understand better." Jessica found her father's letter among the others. His handwriting was different from her mother's, harsher and more direct. "Margaret, stop sending these things. Jessica is asking too many questions and I don't know what to tell her anymore. It's better for her to forget you completely than to live with this false hope. Do not contact her again until she's an adult. Her father was trying to protect her from pain," said Mrs. Dorothy. He thought a definitive heartbreak was better than eternal hope. Jessica spent the rest of the session reading the letters and examining the gifts. Each item told a story of maternal love she had been kept from knowing. The anger she felt toward her mother began to shift into sadness for the lost childhood and the missed chances for connection they never had. "When Stephen died, did you try to reach out to me?" "I did," replied Margaret. "But you had changed your name when you started your business. It took me years to figure out that Jessica Miller and Jessica Taylor Smith were the same person. And when did you find out? It was when I saw your picture in the magazine. I recognized you immediately. Even after all those years, you have the same eyes as when you were a child. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. The family mediation was progressing, but Jessica still struggled with years of resentment. During a particularly difficult session, Dr. Emily suggested a different exercise. Jessica, I'd like you to write a letter to your mother saying everything you feel. It doesn't have to be polite or pretty, just honest. Jessica spent an entire week writing. The letter was 12 pages long, filled with pain, anger, but also questions she had never asked. When the time came to read it in the next session, she realized she had cried over several parts of the text. Mom, I grew up believing you didn't love me enough to stay. I thought I wasn't important to you. I built my whole life trying to prove I was worth something, that I deserved to be loved. Every professional success was an attempt to show you, wherever you were, that you had lost an incredible daughter. Margaret wept as she listened. When Jessica finished reading, she asked for permission to respond. My daughter, not a single day passed without me thinking of you. When I saw girls your age on the street, I wondered how you were growing up. On your birthdays, I'd bake a small cake and sing happy birthday alone, wishing you were well. Why didn't you leave Darren and come back to me? I tried many times, but he always threatened me. Said if I returned, he'd tell everyone I was a mother who abandoned her child. He claimed no one would believe my side about the abuse, that I'd be arrested. And you believed him? I was alone with no money, no education. Darren controlled everything in my life. He convinced me I had no right to you after what I'd done. The sessions continued for 2 more weeks. Gradually, Jessica began to understand the complexity of what her mother had endured. The domestic violence, the social isolation, the psychological manipulation. It had all created a prison Margaret couldn't escape. But one question still weighed heavily on Jessica. If all of this is true, why did you show up at my house asking for money? Why not try to reconnect slowly? Margaret lowered her head, clearly ashamed. Because I was desperate. Darren had passed away, and I found out our house was mortgaged. I lost everything overnight. I thought if you knew I needed help, maybe I'd feel obligated to help. It was selfish of me. I should have tried talking first. But I was so afraid of your rejection that I thought appealing to legal duty would be easier. This honest confession moved Jessica in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time, she saw her mother not as a villain who had destroyed her life, but as a vulnerable woman who had made poor choices under difficult circumstances. During one of the last mediation sessions, Dr. Emily asked a question neither of them expected. So now, what would you like to happen? Jessica stayed silent for a long time before answering. I'd like to meet my real mother. Real. Not the woman who abandoned me, nor the one who showed up asking for money. The real person with her strengths and flaws. And you, Margaret. I'd like the chance to be a mother to my daughter, even if it's too late. I want to meet the amazing woman she's become, and maybe help her in some way if she'll let me. It was then that Judge Robert asked to join a session. When he entered the room, his expression was different from his usual seriousness. I've followed all the session reports, he said, and I'd like to share something personal with you. Jessica and Margaret exchanged glances, surprised by the break in protocol. 15 years ago, I lost contact with my own daughter because of a family misunderstanding. She moved abroad and we haven't spoken since. When I heard that laugh in the courtroom, Jessica, I recognized the pain of someone who'd been abandoned. But I also saw in you, Margaret, the desperation of a mother who lost her daughter. Jessica looked at the photo on the judge's desk with new eyes. It was the same smiling young woman she'd noticed in their first meeting. Is that your daughter in the photo? Yes, Emily. She's the same age as you. And just like you two, our separation started with a misunderstanding that turned into years of silence and wounded pride. Why are you telling us this? Because following your case made me realize life is too short to waste on grudges. Last night, I called my daughter for the first time in 15 years. Margaret and Jessica were moved by the judge's confession. How did the conversation go? Hard at first. She was surprised and a little resentful, but we talked for 2 hours. She's coming to the United States next month to visit. The judge paused before continuing. I'd like to propose something different for your case. Instead of mandatory support payments, how about creating a project where you can work together? Jessica was intrigued. What kind of project? Margaret told me she worked as a seamstress her whole life and has a lot of knowledge about the trade. You, Jessica, own fashion businesses. How about creating a professional training program for women leaving abusive relationships? The idea took them both by surprise. Jessica had never considered using her business experience for social causes, and Margaret never imagined her skills could be useful for something bigger. You wouldn't be obligated to anything, the judge continued. It would be a free choice for both of you. If it works, it could turn your pain into help for other women. Jessica asked for a week to think about the proposal. During that time, she visited Mrs. Dorothy at the nursing home several times, talking through the situation and asking for advice. What do you think I should do? My dear, you've spent your whole life building things, a business, a career, a fortune. How about trying to build a relationship with your mother? What if it doesn't work? What if it does? You've both lost so much time together. You can't get the past back, but you can build a future. At the end of the week, Jessica arrived at the courthouse with her decision. She found Margaret waiting in the mediation room, visibly nervous about the answer to come. I accept the judge's proposal, Jessica said, but with some conditions. What are they? First, this doesn't mean our relationship is automatically restored. We'll need to build trust little by little. Second, if we're going to work together, I need you to be honest with me about everything. No more secrets between us. I agree completely, replied Margaret, emotional. And third, I want us to visit Mrs. Dorothy together every week. She's the most important person in my life, and I want you to know her better. Margaret accepted all the conditions without hesitation. For the first time since the whole process began, mother and daughter embraced. It wasn't a desperate or dramatic hug, but a careful one full of hope and possibilities. Judge Robert formalized the agreement with a smile. Instead of a traditional sentence, they created a pilot social reintegration project that would be jointly managed by Jessica and Margaret, with court supervision during the first year. 2 months later, the New Beginnings project was operating from a rented room in downtown Los Angeles. Jessica had invested $50,000 in sewing equipment and materials, while Margaret had developed a schedule of practical and theoretical classes. The first group consisted of 15 women of varying ages, all coming from situations of domestic violence. Margaret taught sewing and embroidery techniques, while Jessica gave lessons on entrepreneurship and small business management. "Mom, you're a natural teacher," Jessica said one afternoon, watching Margaret patiently explain an embroidery stitch to a struggling student. "I always wanted to be a teacher when I was young," Margaret replied, "but I married early and never got the chance." "It's never too late to chase dreams," Jessica said, smiling. The two had developed a routine. They worked together on the project in the mornings, had lunch at a nearby restaurant, and on Thursday afternoons, they visited Mrs. Dorothy. Little by little, Jessica was rediscovering her mother as a person, not just as the figure who had marked her childhood. Margaret, in turn, was impressed by her daughter's determination and generosity. Whenever she watched Jessica working with the students, she felt a mix of pride and sadness for having missed so many years of this incredible woman's life. "Jessica, can I ask you a personal question?" Margaret said one afternoon as they organized class materials. "Of course. You never married or had children. Was it because I left?" Jessica stopped folding the fabrics and grew thoughtful. "I think so, at least partly. I was always so afraid of being abandoned again. I preferred to focus on my career, where I had control over everything." "I'm so sorry for that." "Don't be. It's not too late for me either. At 35, I can still build a family if I want." During one of their visits to Mrs. Dorothy, the elderly woman made an observation that deeply touched them both. "Do you know what makes me happiest about seeing you together?" "What?" mother and daughter asked at the same time. seeing how you've both become better people because of this experience. Jessica, you're lighter, more human, and Margaret, your eyes have their sparkle back. It was true. Jessica had discovered a passion for helping others that she never knew she had. The project was so successful that she was considering expanding it to other parts of the city. Margaret, in turn, had found a purpose beyond mere survival. Teaching other women to support themselves through handiwork was healing wounds she didn't even know she had. 6 months after the project began, they received an unexpected visit. Judge Robert appeared in the classroom, accompanied by a young blonde woman in her 30s. "Jessica, Margaret, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Emily." The young woman greeted them with a shy smile. "Dad told me all about your project. I wanted to see it for myself." "How was reuniting with your father?" Jessica asked, curious. "Hard at first, but very emotional. I realized we were both too stubborn to make the first move. If you hadn't gone through this situation, maybe he would never have called me." Judge Robert smiled proudly. "Emily is a psychologist. She offered to teach self-esteem and life planning classes for the women in the project, if you agree." Jessica and Margaret accepted immediately. Emily's involvement brought a new dimension to their work. Beyond practical skills, the women began addressing deep emotional issues tied to their past traumas. During one of Emily's classes, one of the students, Mrs. Helen, a 60-year-old woman who had left a 40-year abusive marriage, made a remark that moved everyone. "Watching you two work together, I see it's never too late to start over. If a daughter and mother can reconnect after so long, I can build a new life too." Mrs. Helen became one of the most dedicated students. Within 3 months, she was crocheting pieces to sell at a local market, achieving financial independence for the first time in her life. Jessica began to realize the project wasn't just changing the students' lives, it was shifting her own perspective on success and fulfillment. For years, she'd measured her worth by bank balances and store counts. Now she saw deeper ways to impact the world. "You know, Mom," she said one afternoon as they watched the students working intently, "I think this project is the most important thing I've ever done." "For me too," Margaret replied. "For the first time in decades, I feel my life has a greater purpose." The success of the New Beginnings project caught the media's attention. Newspapers and TV shows sought Jessica and Margaret for interviews about the initiative and their reconciliation story. During one TV interview, Jessica had a revelation about herself. "What's the biggest change in your life after this process?" the host asked. "I learned that holding on to resentment is like driving while only looking in the rearview mirror. You know where you've been, but you can't see where you're going." The interview aired on a Thursday night and sparked widespread discussion on social media. Jessica received messages from across the United States, sharing similar stories of families torn apart by misunderstandings and pride. "Look at this," Margaret said, showing a message on her phone. "This woman hasn't spoken to her daughter in 10 years because of an argument about marriage. She wants to know if she can visit them to talk." Jessica realized they'd created something far bigger than they'd imagined. The project wasn't just helping their students, it was inspiring others to rethink their own family relationships. "What if we expanded the project?" Jessica suggested. "We could add family mediation sessions for people wanting to reconcile with relatives." Margaret loved the idea. They discussed it with Emily and Judge Robert, who offered technical and legal support for the expansion. Within a year, the New Beginnings project became a national model for family mediation and social reintegration, with 3 locations in Los Angeles, 1 in San Diego, and plans to expand further. But the professional growth was matched by even greater personal growth. Jessica and Margaret had not only become mother and daughter again, but also partners and friends. "You know what amazes me most about you?" Jessica said one Sunday during their weekly walk. "What?" "Your ability to start over. At 72 years old, you've built a new career, developed skills you never knew you had, and become an inspiration for other women. That's incredible." "And do you know what makes me proudest of you?" Margaret replied. "Tell me." "Seeing how you turned your pain into healing for others. You could have stayed bitter for the rest of your life, but you chose to use your story to help." The two walked in comfortable silence when Jessica asked a question she'd been holding on to for months. "Mom, do you forgive me for being so harsh with you at first?" "Sweetheart, there's nothing to forgive. You reacted with what you knew at the time. And me? Do you forgive me for abandoning you, even if I had no choice?" "There's nothing to forgive. You did what you thought was best in an impossible situation." They stopped at a park and sat on a bench under a large tree. It was the same spot where Jessica used to come as a child with Mrs. Dorothy to play on weekends. "You know something funny?" Jessica said. "All those years I dreamed about the day you'd come back. I imagined how our conversation would go, what I'd say, how you'd apologize. I never thought our reconciliation would happen through a social project." "Life has its ways of surprising us," Margaret answered. "When I filed that lawsuit, I just wanted money to survive. I never imagined I'd find a daughter, a career, and a purpose." 2 years after that piercing laughter in the courtroom, Jessica and Margaret were invited to speak about family reconciliation at the same courthouse where it all began. The auditorium was packed with families in similar situations: lawyers, psychologists, and social workers. Judge Robert introduced them. 2 years ago, I witnessed one of the most painful reactions I've ever seen in court: a daughter laughing at her own mother during a hearing. Today, I have the honor of introducing 2 women who turned pain into purpose, anger into understanding, and separation into collaboration. Jessica stepped onto the stage, nervous but emotional. She looked at the audience and saw families sitting on opposite sides, clearly in conflict. "My name is Jessica Miller," she began, "and 2 years ago, I was a highly successful businesswoman, but completely lost in relationships. I carried a 27-year-old hurt that was eating me alive." Margaret joined her on stage, and I'm Margaret, the mother who abandoned this incredible woman when she was just 8. For decades, I lived with guilt and regret, but lacked the courage to face the consequences of my choices. They shared their whole story: the abandonment, the years of silence, the lawsuit, the mediation, and finally, the creation of the social project. They spoke about the struggles of reconciliation, the moments they almost gave up, and the revelations that changed their perspectives. "Forgiveness isn't an event," Jessica said. "It's a process. It didn't happen overnight. It took months of hard conversations, therapy, and seeing the real person behind my image of a villain." "And reconciliation doesn't mean forgetting the past," Margaret added. "It means understanding the context, accepting that people make bad choices for complex reasons, and deciding to build something new with that understanding." During the Q&A, a young woman in her 20s raised her hand. "My mum kicked me out when she found out I was gay. That was 3 years ago. How do I know if reconciliation is worth trying?" Jessica and Margaret exchanged a glance before answering. "The first question is, do you feel there's love beneath the rejection?" Jessica said. "In our case, no matter how much pain there was, love was always there. If there's love, it's worth trying." "And the second question is, are you willing to accept that the person might not change?" added Margaret. "Reconciliation doesn't mean the other person will become who you wish they were. It means accepting who they are and deciding whether a relationship with that real person is possible." The talk lasted 2 hours and ended with a standing ovation. Several people approached Jessica and Margaret afterward to thank them and ask for advice about their own family situations. "You saved my family," said a middle-aged man with tears in his eyes. "My son and I hadn't spoken in 5 years. After hearing you, I'm calling him today." On the way home, Jessica and Margaret talked about the impact their story was having on others. "Sometimes I think we went through all of this not just to reconcile, but to help other families," said Jessica. "Maybe the pain we endured has a greater purpose," Margaret agreed. "If our story keeps other families from wasting years without speaking, it will all have been worth it." On the 3rd anniversary of the court case, Judge Robert organized a celebration at the Los Angeles County Courthouse to honor the results of the New Beginnings project. Attendees included all the women from the first class, many now successful entrepreneurs, families reconciled through the mediation program, and judicial officials interested in replicating the model. Mrs. Dorothy, now 89, was the guest of honor. She arrived in a wheelchair, but with the same warm smile as always. "My dear," she said, holding Jessica's hands, When you were little, I always knew you'd do important things in life. I just never imagined it would be this important. You taught me the values that made all of this possible, Jessica replied. Without the foundation you gave me, none of it would have happened. Margaret stepped closer and took Mrs. Dorothy's hands as well. Thank you for taking care of my girl when I couldn't. You were the mother she needed when I failed. There was no failure, my dear, the elderly woman said. There were hard circumstances and difficult choices. What matters is that in the end, you found your way back to each other. During the celebration, Judge Robert pulled Jessica and Margaret aside. I have a proposal for you, he said with a mysterious smile. What kind of proposal? The Department of Justice wants to create a national program based on the New Beginnings model. Would you be willing to oversee its implementation across the country? Jessica and Margaret were stunned by the scale of the proposal. It would mean extensive travel, training teams in multiple cities, developing a national schedule, the judge explained. At least a 3-year commitment. And we'd do it together, Jessica asked. Yes, the idea is for you to lead the team, sharing your expertise with professionals across the United States. Mother and daughter exchanged glances and smiled. I'm in, said Jessica. Me too, said Margaret. But we have one condition, Jessica added. Mrs. Dorothy comes with us on every trip. She's a vital part of our story, and we want her to see the national impact of what started in Los Angeles. Judge Robert laughed. I figured you'd say that. A care team for Mrs. Dorothy is already included in the budget. 6 months later, Jessica, Margaret, and Mrs. Dorothy were at the Washington, D.C. airport, heading to Miami to launch the first regional branch of the National New Beginnings Project. The program had surpassed all expectations, and they were welcomed like celebrities in every city they visited. Who would have thought, Jessica mused, watching the airport bustle, that a laugh in the courthouse would turn into all this? Life is funny like that, replied Margaret. Sometimes our lowest moments become the starting points for our greatest triumphs. Mrs. Dorothy, who had been dozing in her wheelchair, woke up to the sound of the conversation. What are you talking about? We were remembering how it all began, said Jessica. Oh yes, that day at the courthouse, the elderly woman smiled. I knew from the very first moment that you two would work things out. How so? Asked Margaret, curious. Because I saw the love beneath the anger. Jessica laughed, but her eyes were full of tears, and Margaret cried, but her eyes were full of hope. Where there's love, there's always a way. The 3 women embarked on another chapter of their shared journey. In Miami, they would hear new stories of separated families, help other women rebuild their lives, and continue spreading the message that it's never too late for forgiveness and new beginnings. Over the following years, the National New Beginnings Project became one of the country's most successful social programs. More than 200 branches were established across the United States, serving thousands of women and mediating hundreds of family reconciliations. Jessica never married or had biological children, but she always said she had hundreds of daughters scattered across the country, all the women who had gone through the project and rebuilt their lives. Margaret became one of the most sought-after speakers on domestic violence and family reconciliation in the nation. Mrs. Dorothy traveled with them across the United States until she was 92, when she decided she'd rather stay in Los Angeles, receiving visits from the granddaughters of her heart she had met along the way. 5 years after that laughter that shocked the courthouse, Jessica was in her office when she received a phone call that would change her life once again. Jessica? Said an unfamiliar male voice on the other end. Yes, who is this? My name is David Dorothy. I'm Mrs. Dorothy's grandson. She gave me your number. Jessica was puzzled. Mrs. Dorothy had never mentioned any grandchildren. Mrs. Dorothy never told me about you. Actually, we lost touch many years ago. I heard about your story from a TV report and decided to look for my grandmother. She told me everything about you and your mother. I see. And why are you calling me? I'd like to meet you in person. My grandmother speaks so highly of you that I feel like you're already part of the family. Jessica smiled. It was just like Mrs. Dorothy to keep bringing people together and creating connections even at 93. Of course. How about Sunday? I always visit Mrs. Dorothy on Sunday mornings. Perfect. I'll be there. When Jessica arrived at the nursing home the following Sunday, she found Mrs. Dorothy beaming with happiness beside a tall man with brown hair and a kind smile who appeared to be around 40. "Jessica, this is my grandson David," said Mrs. Dorothy, practically glowing with pride. "David, this is Jessica, my daughter of the heart." The meeting was natural and pleasant. David shared that he was a doctor, had recently moved to Los Angeles to work at a hospital, and was looking for ways to get involved in social work in the city. "Your grandmother told me about your project," he said. "I specialize in mental health and would love to know if there's any way I can help." Jessica was struck by David's sincerity and genuine interest. As they talked, she noticed he had the same kindness and wisdom as Mrs. Dorothy, along with a passion for helping others that aligned perfectly with the project's values. "How about joining us next Monday?" Jessica suggested. "You can see the project firsthand and decide if it's something that resonates with you." David agreed immediately. The following Monday, he accompanied Jessica and Margaret through a full morning of project activities. He observed the sewing classes, joined a life planning session with Emily, and had long conversations with several of the students about their stories and challenges. "This work is incredible," he said at the end of the day. "You're addressing both the symptoms and the root causes of the problems at the same time. It's a very comprehensive approach." "Would you like to join us?" Margaret asked. "Very much. I could offer free psychological counseling to any students who need more specialized support." David's involvement brought a new dimension to the project. He developed a mental health program specifically for women who were victims of domestic violence and created support groups that met weekly. But for Jessica, David's arrival meant much more than just adding a qualified collaborator. For the first time in many years, she felt genuinely interested in getting to know a man better. There was something about his kindness, the way he treated the students with respect and warmth, that stirred feelings she had buried decades ago. "He likes you," Margaret said one afternoon after observing Jessica and David's interaction during a meeting. "How do you know?" "I'm your mother, and besides, it's obvious. He looks at you the same way your father looked at me in the early years of our marriage." Jessica felt her heart race. It had been years since she'd even considered the possibility of a romantic relationship. "And you? Do you like him?" Margaret asked. Jessica stayed silent for a moment before answering. "I think so, but I'm scared." "Scared of what?" "Of being disappointed, of him finding out I'm too complicated, of not knowing how to be a girlfriend after so many years focused only on work." Margaret smiled tenderly. "Sweetheart, you've spent your whole life believing you didn't deserve love because I left. But look at everything you've built, all the people you've helped. You're an amazing woman, and you deserve to be happy." It was Mrs. Dorothy who gave Jessica the final push she needed. "My dear," the elderly woman said during one of their Sunday visits, "my grandson is in love with you, and I know you well enough to see that you're interested in him too." "Mrs. Dorothy, I don't know if I'm good at relationships. I've never had a serious one in my life." "So what? You didn't know how to be a businesswoman until you became one. You didn't know how to reconcile with your mother until you did it. You didn't know how to help other women until you started the project. You learn by doing, my dear." A few weeks later, during a project event, David asked to speak with Jessica privately. "Jessica, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Would you like to have dinner with me? Not as co-workers, but as an actual date?" Jessica felt her cheeks flush. "I'd love to, but I should warn you, I'm a little awkward at these things." David laughed. "Me too. It's been 3 years since I've gone out with anyone. How about we figure it out together?" Their first date was at a small Italian restaurant near the project. They talked for hours about their lives, dreams, fears, and hopes. Jessica shared the whole story of reconciling with her mother, and David spoke about how losing his parents young had motivated him to dedicate himself to medicine. "You know what impresses me most about you?" David said at the end of the evening. "What?" "Your ability to turn pain into healing. Not everyone can use their worst experiences to help others." "And you know what impresses me most about you?" Jessica replied. "Tell me." "Your genuine kindness. You treat every person as if they're the most important in the world. That's rare. The relationship between Jessica and David developed naturally and gradually. They would meet for dinner once a week, spend Saturdays working together on the project, and on Sundays, they visited Mrs. Dorothy as a trio. Margaret watched her daughter's romance with joy and a touch of nostalgia. "Seeing you in love reminds me of when I was young," she said one afternoon. "Don't you think about getting involved with anyone?" asked Jessica. "At 74, I think I've had enough relationships for a lifetime," Margaret laughed. "Now I'm happy being a grandmother to the girls in the project and watching you build your own happiness." 6 months after their first meeting, David proposed to Jessica during a graduation ceremony for the project. He stepped onto the stage, took the microphone and addressed an emotional audience. "Jessica Miller, you've transformed my life, just as you've transformed the lives of hundreds of women here today. Will you marry me?" The crowd erupted in applause. Jessica stepped onto the stage with tears in her eyes and said yes into the microphone, her voice carrying through the entire auditorium. The wedding took place a year later, a simple ceremony in the garden of the senior home where Mrs. Dorothy lived. The elderly woman, now 95 and using oxygen, insisted on being the matron of honor. "Finally, I'll have a grandson too," Margaret joked during the celebration. "And I'll have a mother-in-law who's also my work partner," David laughed. This should be interesting. Jessica and David spent their honeymoon traveling across the United States to visit all the branches of the New Beginnings project. It was a working honeymoon, but also a celebration of everything they had built together as a family. 2 years after the wedding, Jessica discovered she was pregnant at 40. The news came on a Friday morning during a routine checkup at the doctor's office. "Congratulations, you're expecting a baby," the doctor said with a smile. Jessica was in shock. After decades believing she would never be a mother, the possibility of having her own child seemed almost unreal. She rushed to the project to share the news with Margaret and David, who were wrapping up a meeting with the administrative team. "Mom, David, can you come here for a moment?" When they approached, Jessica simply handed the blood test results to Margaret. "What's this?" her mother asked, putting on her glasses to read. When she understood the result, Margaret screamed with joy and hugged her daughter tightly. "Oh my God, I'm going to be a grandmother." David took the test from his mother-in-law's hands and stood frozen for a few seconds before lifting Jessica into his arms and spinning her around. "We're going to be parents." Jessica's pregnancy became a collective event at the project. All the students followed every stage with excitement, offering advice, help, and knitting baby clothes. Mrs. Dorothy, despite her advanced age, insisted on knitting a special blanket for her soon-to-arrive great-grandson. "This baby is going to be so loved," one of the students said during a sewing class. "She'll have a mother, a father, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and over 1,000 aunties spread across the entire country." Jessica gave birth to a baby girl on a sunny spring morning. They named her Hope Dorothy, in honor of the 2 women who had most influenced their lives. Mrs. Dorothy, now 96, held her great-granddaughter in her arms with tears in her eyes. "This little girl will grow up knowing she is loved," the elderly woman said. "She'll grow up in a family that found its way back, that overcame every hardship, that turned pain into love." Margaret became an incredibly devoted grandmother. Every day she stopped by Jessica and David's apartment to help with the baby, singing lullabies, telling stories, and teaching Hope her first words. "You know what's the most amazing thing?" Jessica said one afternoon, watching Margaret rock her granddaughter to sleep. "What?" "Seeing you be the grandmother you couldn't be as a mother to me. It's as if time gave us a second chance, the 2 of us. And Hope will never doubt that she's loved," Margaret replied. "She'll grow up seeing that her family chose each other, forgave each other, rebuilt itself. That's the gift we're giving her." Years passed. The National New Beginnings Project became an international model, replicated in other countries across Latin America. Jessica and David had 2 more daughters, Grace and Hope, forming a loud and happy family. Mrs. Dorothy passed away peacefully at 100 years old, surrounded by the entire extended family she had helped raise. Her funeral was a celebration of life, with hundreds of people sharing stories about how she had impacted their journeys. "She lived long enough to see 4 generations of our family," Jessica said during the wake, "and she left behind a legacy of love that will live on forever." Margaret, now 82, still worked for the project, though on reduced hours. She spent her mornings teaching sewing and her afternoons playing with her granddaughters. "Sometimes I think I've had 3 lives," she said in a conversation with Jessica. "The first was when I was young and made so many mistakes. The second was when I lived in suffering and isolation. And the third began when we found each other again. This third life has been the best of all." Jessica, now 45, had become one of the most respected women in the country in family mediation and social entrepreneurship. But when asked about her greatest achievements, she always answered the same way. "My greatest achievement was learning to forgive. Everything else came as a result." One Sunday afternoon, 10 years after that laughter in the courthouse, Jessica stood in her backyard watching her 3 daughters play with Margaret. David was preparing a barbecue, and the sound of laughter filled the air. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, walking over and wrapping an arm around his wife's waist. "I'm thinking about how unpredictable life is. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd be here today, married with 3 daughters, working with my mother, I'd have said it was impossible. And what changed everything? The courage to let go of resentment, the courage to believe people can change, that families can heal, that it's never too late for love." Margaret walked over, holding Hope, the youngest granddaughter, in her arms. "What are you two talking about?" "We were remembering how we got here," Jessica replied. "Oh, the journey," Margaret smiled. "When I think about everything we've been through, I'm amazed by the power of reconciliation. Not just between the 2 of us, but with all the families we've helped reunite." "How many has it been now?" David asked. "Over 3,000 documented family reconciliations," Jessica answered. "But I imagine the real number is much higher, considering all the people who heard our story and decided to reach out to distant relatives." The 3 girls ran over to the adults, asking for attention and cuddles. Hope, now 6, asked a question that caught everyone by surprise. "Mommy, why didn't you and Grandma Margaret live together when you were little like me?" Jessica and Margaret exchanged glances, knowing this question would come one day. "It's a complicated story, sweetheart," Jessica said. "Sometimes, people who love each other need to be apart for a while before they learn how to be together again." "But did you love each other?" "Always," Margaret replied. "Even when we were apart, even when we were angry, we always loved each other. Love doesn't disappear just because people separate." "And now you'll stay together forever?" "Forever," Jessica and Margaret said at the same time, making the girls laugh. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Jessica and Margaret sat on the porch, sipping tea and talking, as they did every Sunday evening. "Mom, can I ask you something I've always wanted to but never had the courage to?" "Of course, sweetheart. Do you regret leaving that day?" Margaret stayed silent for a long moment, carefully thinking about her answer. "It's complicated. I regret leaving you. I regret missing so many years of your life. I regret not finding a better way out of that situation. But I don't regret leaving. Because staying would have meant accepting the violence forever. And maybe, if I had stayed, you would have grown up thinking it was normal for a woman to accept being mistreated. I never thought of it that way. What comforts me is knowing that, in the end, everything worked out. You grew up strong and independent, became an amazing woman, built a beautiful family, and we found each other again when we were both ready to forgive and start over. Do you think it was fate? I think it was love. Love always finds a way." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars in the Los Angeles sky. 10 years earlier, they could never have imagined being there, side by side, sharing this peace. "You know what makes me happiest?" Jessica said. "Tell me." "Knowing that my daughters will grow up seeing that problems can be solved with conversation, that families can heal, that forgiveness is possible. They'll never carry the kind of pain I did." "That's the best legacy we can leave them," Margaret agreed. "And for all the women who've been through the project too. Each of them will teach their children that there's always hope. The next morning, Monday, Jessica and Margaret arrived at the project for another day of work. The routine had become precious. Breakfast together, team meetings, classes with new students, one-on-one sessions, planning for upcoming activities. During the sewing class, a new student, Megan, a 25-year-old who had recently left an abusive relationship, asked a question that would stay with them forever. Mrs. Margaret, Mrs. Jessica, how did you know you'd be able to forgive each other? Jessica and Margaret exchanged glances, remembering all the mediation sessions, all the tears, all the painful revelations. Truthfully, we didn't know, Jessica answered. There were times we thought it would be impossible, but we decided to try one day at a time. And what kept you from giving up? Realizing that holding on to resentment hurts more than forgiving, Margaret said, and discovering that beneath all the pain there was still love. Do you have any advice for someone just starting this process? Jessica thought for a moment before answering. First, be patient with yourself. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a process that takes time. Second, don't be afraid to feel anger or sadness along the way. Those emotions are part of healing. And third, remember that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or accepting bad behavior. It means choosing not to let the past control your present. What about you, Mrs. Margaret? My advice is, be honest about your mistakes and take responsibility for them. Don't try to justify everything you did. Just explain the context and ask for forgiveness sincerely. And be patient, because the person you hurt may need time to process everything. The conversation continued for another hour, with other students sharing their own experiences of forgiveness and reconciliation. It was common for these discussions to arise spontaneously during classes, turning the project not just into a place for technical learning, but into a community of emotional healing. At the end of the day, Jessica was organizing materials when she got an unexpected call. Jessica, it's Barbara Johnson, the attorney who represented your mother in the original case. Jessica was surprised. I hadn't spoken to Attorney Barbara since the mediation ended. Hi, attorney, how are you? I'm well, thank you. I'm calling because I have a client in a situation very similar to what you went through. A mother and daughter who haven't spoken in years because of family misunderstandings. Can I refer them to you for mediation? Jessica smiled. Even after all these years, they still received requests like this regularly. Of course, attorney. Send us the family's details, and we'll reach out to schedule an initial conversation. Thank you, Jessica, and congratulations on everything you've built. I follow your work in the media and get emotional seeing the impact you're having. You were part of this story too. If you hadn't agreed to represent my mother, we might never have gotten here. After hanging up, Jessica told Margaret about the call. Another family that can benefit from our experience, Margaret said, smiling. Sometimes I'm amazed by how many families live through situations like ours. It's because people are proud and afraid to take the first step. When they see reconciliation is possible, it gives them courage to try too. On her way home, Jessica passed by the courthouse where it all began. The building looked exactly the same, but to her, it now represented something completely different. It was no longer the place where she'd let out the worst laugh of her life, but rather the starting point for the greatest transformation she'd ever experienced. That evening, during family dinner, Grace, their middle daughter, now 4 years old, made a comment that moved everyone. "Daddy, I want to be like Mommy and Grandma Margaret when I grow up." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" David asked. "I want to help sad people become happy again." Jessica and Margaret exchanged teary glances. Seeing the next generation already embracing values of compassion and forgiveness was the greatest proof they'd completely transformed their family legacy. "You can be whatever you want when you grow up," Jessica said, "but I'm happy to hear you want to help people. Grandma Margaret taught me that when someone is angry, it's because their heart hurts, so we need to be patient and help heal the pain." Margaret stood up and hugged her granddaughter tightly. "You're a very wise girl, Grace." Years later, when Margaret turned 85, the family threw a big party to celebrate not just her birthday, but also the legacy she'd built. Hundreds of former participants from the project, families reconciled through the program, professionals working at units across the country, and officials who'd supported the national expansion were all present. Judge Robert, now retired but still involved as a consultant, gave an emotional speech. 15 years ago, I witnessed one of the most painful scenes of my career, a daughter laughing at her own mother in court. Today, I'm here celebrating one of the most beautiful stories of transformation I've ever known. Jessica and Margaret proved that love is stronger than resentment, forgiveness more powerful than revenge, and that it's never too late to start over. Jessica took the stage to speak on behalf of the family. 15 years ago, I was a very bitter woman. I had professional success but felt empty inside. Today I'm whole. I have a wonderful mother, an incredible husband, 3 beautiful daughters, and a purpose that gets me out of bed excited every day. She paused, looking at Margaret in the audience. Mom, thank you for having the courage to come back into my life, even knowing you'd be rejected at first. Thank you for persisting when I was harsh and inflexible. Thank you for turning our pain into purpose. And thank you for being the most devoted grandmother my daughters could ever have. Margaret stepped onto the stage and embraced her daughter to warm applause from the audience. Sweetheart, thank you for giving me a second chance. Thank you for opening your heart to truly know me. Thank you for letting me be part of my granddaughters' lives. And thank you for us building something far greater than ourselves together. The party continued late into the night, with music, dancing, and many stories being shared. It was a celebration not just of a birthday, but of 15 years of reconciliation, growth, and social impact. At the end of the night, when they were back home, Jessica found Margaret on the porch, gazing at the stars. What are you thinking about, Mom? I'm thinking about how generous life is. I made so many mistakes, hurt you deeply, wasted precious years, but life gave me the chance to make things right and even do something meaningful for others. We both got a second chance, and we made the most of it. Do you think our story will inspire people for years to come? I'm sure of it, because it's a story about the best in people, the ability to forgive, to start over, to turn pain into love. They sat in silence for a few minutes, soaking in the peace of the moment. Jessica, can I ask you something? Always, Mom. Are you happy? Jessica smiled, looking through the window at the room where her 3 daughters slept, thinking of her husband tidying up the kitchen, remembering the productive workday they'd had. I'm completely happy, and you? Me too. At 85, I've learned that every day is worth living like it's a gift, and every day with all of you truly is. End of story. Now, tell me what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your heartfelt words in the comments. Do you believe Jessica made the right choice in forgiving her mother? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other touching stories.